Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. I just want to talk a little bit about the 1980s. I'm gonna do a retrospect. I did a retrospective on the 90s. I did a retrospective on the 2000s, and I did a retrospective on the 2010s. I wanted to do one a little bit on the 80s. I was a little hesitant to do it at first and said I wasn't gonna do it because I'm 34 years old and I was only alive for 4 years of the 1980s. But I love this era. Looking back, I love to study this era. So here goes my best attempt at trying to talk about the entertainment, the pop culture, the wrestling, television, and the lifestyle of the 1980s. A lot of it I got from Wikipedia, and a lot of it I got from my mom, who was alive in the 80s at the time, interested in culture at that time. So, uh, the decade started off in a really somber place because the 70s, after the Vietnam War, the United States had experienced kind of a general sadness. President Carter at the time, he called it a malaise. The economy wasn't doing so well. Iran, we had just instituted the embargo on Iran after their revolution in 1979. And things were basically going to shit. There were long lines around the block waiting for gas, and a lot of Americans were suffering, and they were looking for something different. And then that something different, they found an out of work actor, a Democrat turned Republican, Ronald Wilson Reagan. And one of his campaign slogans was, "Are you better now than you were 4 years ago?" And a lot of Americans, unfortunately, in 1974, had taken a gamble with Jimmy Carter, an unknown political novice, and they felt that the gamble did not pay off. They felt that Jimmy Carter was weak, that he was ineffective, and that he was just an overall bad president. And they wanted somebody who was a little bit tougher on America's adversaries, particularly Iran. Well, Ronald Reagan had played a cowboy on TV, and he played a football player on TV, so they call him the Gipper. And he was going to come out guns blazing against not only Iran, but against the Soviet Union. He directly called the Soviet Union an evil empire, and he threatened to attack the Soviet Union if need be. Over the years, I've spoken to people from Russia and from the former Soviet satellite states, and they tell me that they were really scared of Reagan when he was president because they felt like he could launch an atomic bomb at them anytime, you know? So, anyway, he beats Jimmy Carter in a landslide. Even the traditional blue states like New York and Reagan's home state of California vote for him. It was unbelievable. Like, the whole nation hated Mr. Carter. He didn't have a friend in the world, and even today, in the history books, he goes down as probably one of the worst presidents, with his only bright spot being able to negotiate peace between Sadat and Menachem Begin in the Camp David Accords. But Reagan comes in with his new plan of Reaganomics. And this whole thing of Reaganomics is that he's going to cut taxes on the rich and hope that their success and prosperity trickles down to to the poor. Now, George H.W. Bush, who would become his vice president, actually said that this economic plan uh, would be not be any good for the country, that it would actually be called voodoo. It would be voodoo economics. That there was no way that the wealthy were going to share some of the success with the poor. Anyway, it was an embrace of Milton Friedman, the economist, economic philosophy, and a rebuke of the Keynesian economic theory that we have been using for years since the New Deal. So it was kind of a reversal of course in our economic policy since the New Deal. Because ever since the New Deal, we had expanded the size of government with LBJ's Great Society and even some of Nixon's things like the APA. But Reagan was looking to roll all that back. In his inauguration speech, Ronald Reagan said, um, "Government can't solve the problem. Government is the problem." So he was going to roll back government programs massively. The problem with this was that many African Americans and many minorities of people of color didn't care for Mr. Reagan. And one of the reasons why they didn't care for Mr. Reagan was he chose to inaugurate his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, the city in which three former civil rights um, activists, Goodman, Schwammer, and Cheney, were killed in Freedom Summer in the 1960s. And this infuriated them. It also infuriated them that Ronald Reagan often portrayed in some of his language, he portrayed African American women as welfare queens and freeloaders. And, was just really rude. And that he seemed like he was very antagonistic towards the civil rights advancements, wanting to roll them back to the 1950s. He talked about making America strong again. And for him and his followers, that meant undoing everything that had been done during the civil rights era. Well, he succeeded to an extent, but he did not succeed because it was morning in America when he got elected, but not everybody was cool with him. He had many different enemies, particularly, like I said, in the minority communities and in the Soviet Union. There's actually a video of him during his 1980 campaign. It's on YouTube, of him going to the Bronx and him having a discussion with someone in the Bronx. And they said, "Well, what are you going to do for us?" And he's yelling and screaming at them. And it looks really bad on him. It looks like he's totally out of touch with the minority community, which he was. Well, he wins the election. People don't really like him because his plan doesn't really work. But one thing that changes his fortunes is he gets assassinated by a madman by the name of John Hinckley Jr. John Hinckley Jr. wanted to assassinate the president because he wanted to impress Jodie Foster in the movie, in Martin Scorsese's movie, The Taxi Driver, and he become obsessed with her. And he tried to contact her on a constant basis, but couldn't. So I guess he figured shooting the president would be the best way um, to to reach this girl's attention. It wasn't. Ronald Reagan survived, and the he had the he then had the support of the American people on his side. Not unanimously, because he still got embroiled in controversies. One such controversy was in 1986 when he got accused of selling arms with Iran, who again we had an embargo with. He sold arms to Iran for money in order to give to the Sandinistas in Nicaragua to fight against the communist regime. Because Reagan was big around the world. He wanted to sponsor all these freedom fighters, these right wing fighters, to fight against communist regimes. He did this in Grenada, he did this in Nicaragua, and he did this in El Salvador, and it sparked civil wars all around the world because he was so anti-communist. But he did sell arms to Iran for these hostages, and also someone said that he was involved with trafficking and bringing in cocaine as well into the country, which eventually developed into crack, which eventually wreaked havoc on the urban Black and Latino communities in the 1980s. And speaking of that, the drug problem was on the rise in the 80s, and the response to that from Mr. Reagan and his wife was just say no. Nancy Reagan launched an infamous campaign of just say no, and it infuriated a lot of people that they would do this, and then they would they would be directly the ones dealing the drugs in from Nicaragua, you know, and they would have the audacity to tell us to just say no. It infuriated a lot of people. What also infuriated a lot of people about Mr. Reagan was that he refused to acknowledge the growth of the AIDS crisis in the 80s. As people were dying in the streets and people were hurting and crying, Mr. Reagan acted like nothing was happening. He even turned away Haitian refugees that wanted to come to this country thanks to a coup that he had instituted with the overthrow of Haitian leadership. He had instituted this coup, yet he wanted us. He didn't want us to take in these Haitian refugees. He would turn them away. So it just made a lot of people mad. But he was a great communicator, he was a great actor, and he charmed the hell out of this nation. Bill Hicks had a joke years ago about Reagan where he said, "You don't know that Reagan is fucking you because you say he looks great on TV, he's full of patriotism, but oh my God, he's fucking him." And you can't kill him no matter what you do. He bounces back. I'm back. I'm back. He always came back. So, yeah, that was Mr. Reagan. But in response to Reagan, we had a lot of people, especially we had the rise of hip hop. Hip hop had come out in the late 70s. 1979 was the first song ever created and put on wax by the Sugar Hill Gang. And this song was so revolutionary because nobody had ever heard anything like this. Of course, the beat was copied from Chic, but it really didn't matter. This was the trend from disco because there was such an in the early 80s there was such an outlash against disco to such a degree that they actually took a bunch of disco records and took them to um, Fenway Park where the Boston Red Sox played baseball at, and they burned them and they screamed disco sucks, disco sucks. So it was a repudiation of not only disco but of black culture as well. But in the black culture, out of disco came hip hop. And like I said in the beginning, it was formularized. It was put together by record companies like Sugar Hill, like Sylvia Robinson, hip hop, hippie to the hippie to hip, that sort of thing. But in the latter part of the decade, particularly 84, 85, Russell Simmons and Rick Rubin got together and they formed Def Jam. And what they did was they revolutionized the sound of rap. They made it hard, tougher, they made it harder, and they commercialized some of the first rap groups like Run DMC, like the Beastie Boys, like LL Cool J, and really brought rap into our living rooms in different ways. And one of the ways they did this was by appealing to the MTV audience. MTV, which was also founded in the 80s, um, wasn't playing any because again against the backlash against disco and the backlash against black culture, they didn't want to play any rap music. They didn't want to play any R&B music. They were only playing album music, which meant they were only playing rock music at the time, and it was heavily segregated. Well, long story short, in 1983, Billie Jean becomes so popular that they are forced to play. Um, they are forced to play this music, and you know they don't have a choice. They have to play Michael Jackson's music, not only Billie Jean, but later Beat It, which also had Eddie Van Halen on the hook. It had Eddie Van Halen on the hook, so it was suitable for MTV at that time. So they just didn't want to play because he was a black artist. Well, Def Jam figured out that same formula, and they used um, Aerosmith. Run DMC did a cover of Walk This Way, and they not only did the cover, but they had Aerosmith in the video, and it relaunched the career of Aerosmith, and it launched um, Run DMC into a new audience and rap music itself. But yeah, Def Jam completely dominated the decade with the young, like I said, young rapper. LL Cool J was like a battle rapper, but at the same time, with songs like I Need Love, he was very suave and he was very appealing to the ladies. Um, in terms of R&B, we saw the rise of artists like Anita Baker, artists like Luther Vandross, artists like Shaka Khan that really had that smooth, quiet storm produced sound that was different than the R&B of the 70s, where R&B of the 70s was more funk, more soulful. This was more commercial, but it was still very good. Luther Vandross could sing his heart out, man. He was one of the greatest R&B artists ever. But it sort of tried to distance itself from hip hop in the early days. As hip hop grew, R&B sort of did its own thing and didn't want to be associated with that in those days. It wasn't until the 90s, like I said, with Mary J. Blige and Lauryn Hill and the Fugees, that changed. But in the 80s, R&B was over here, hip hop was over here. R&B had their audience, hip hop had their audience, and that was sort of the environment that artists like Mariah Carey and Whitney Houston grew up with. Because like you see Whitney Houston's first song, "I Want to Dance with Somebody," it's not really that hip hop-ish like. It's more of a pop song, and that's how they designed it. Greatest Love of All, that's how they designed it. You know, more slick, more produced. That was just 80s R&B. You had groups like Atlantic Starr that would come out with Secret Lovers, really smooth shit. Whereas rap was more on the rough edges of things coming a street produced sound. In the late 80s, particularly in 1980, 89 or so, you had Public Enemy come out. Now, Public Enemy was different because it was political. You know, in response to what Reagan was doing, in response to the onslaught of civil rights activism and the onslaught of equality against African Americans, somebody like Chuck D came out and started to talk about what was really going on. He started to quote Louis Farrakhan of the Nation of Islam. He started to quote Malcolm X. Fight the Power was an anthem among anthems. They would come out with their S1Ws, right? Terminator X. And you saw, like, in the Fight the Power video, how militant they was. And their music got a lot of people interested in politics because they would listen to their songs and they would hear certain snippets of Farrakhan in his lectures, or the Honorable Elijah Muhammad talking in his lectures. And they would be like, whoa, that kind of does something to me. So, and then you had other groups that would copy that, like X Clan, right? Or Brand Nubian. Groups that were influenced by the conscious side of hip hop that you really weren't seeing before. So that was different, and that kind of uh, led into movies as well. Because Spike Lee came out, he came out with Do the Right Thing, he came out with Jungle Fever, he came out with School Days, movies that really challenged the African American experience from an intellectual level in ways that a lot of other movies before that, black exploitation movies of the '70s, surely weren't doing that. And as much as I love them, hood movies of the 1990s weren't doing that either. You know, it was challenging your perspective. And the ending of Do the Right Thing kind of segues into um, what eventually really happened in the 1992 riots in Los Angeles, where this whole situation of racial animosity and bias kind of bubbled over, and kids were listening to Louis Farrakhan and listening to Jesse Jackson and listening to these civil rights leaders. And what really prompted a lot of the young people to listen to these guys too was the election of 1984. Here, Ronald Reagan is up for re-election, and Jesse Jackson runs against him. And Jesse's doing really well, but then Jesse has a quote during the election where he says, "I don't know if I could win in New York because it's Jaime Town," and a lot of Jewish people um, got offended by Jesse's comments, and who came to his defense? None other than Louis Farrakhan. You know what I mean? So uh, then Louis Farrakhan then said his infamous quote that the Jews hide behind their gutter religion, which was taken out of context, by the way. It wasn't to say that they have a gutter religion, that they use religion to bully people. Not just they, but Muslims, he said too, as well, and Christians too. Not just they. So anyway, Jesse Jackson's campaign was completely destroyed, but it was a launching pad for a greater discussion. The term African American began to be used largely after that campaign, and it also, just like Public Enemy's music, it propelled Louis Farrakhan into the national discussion. Once in the Nation of Islam, into the national discussion where it had not been since the 1960s. So racial consciousness of the people, because of what was going on with Reagan's cutbacks, really rose in the 80s. Which I feel like it culminated in the Million Man March. Even though the Million Man March happened in 1995 and that move was kind of past, that was still some leftover residue from what had happened in the 80s and in the 80s. Now, while you had groups that were doing that were very conscious, you had other groups that were just as absurd as Public Enemy, but they were not so, they were just mad. And NWA was one of them. Came out in 1986. Their first album, uh, Straight Outta Compton, and you know, they would come out with "Fuck the Police," "Straight Outta Compton," shit you never heard of because you never saw before cursing in music. You never saw um, cursing in music at all. Vulgarity in music did not exist, right? But NWA took that chance, and NWA, by doing that, created a subgenre of rap music that would lead us into the 90s, into gangster rap. Now, you can't really talk about 80s music without talking about these two people. One is Michael Jackson, and the other is Madonna. These two people dominated the 1980s music scene like no other two people on earth. These two people, Michael Jackson, of course, started off the decade really strong with his Off the Wall album in 1979. But Off the Wall was sort of like a disco album in a way. It was kind of disco. So 1983's Thriller, to me, was the album that changed it all because he broadened his appeal. He brought in Paul McCartney, he brought in Eddie Van Halen and everything. So it sounded more like a pop and a rock album. And that was also the year that they had the Motown 25 celebration in which he moonwalked and he just blew everybody away. Nobody had ever seen nothing like this. Moonwalk. Like he shocked the world, man. He shocked the world. And of course, in the 80s too, he went on tour with his brothers, the Victory Tour, in which he burned his hair. And it was when he burned his hair in 1983, when he was at his height, that all these rumors about him started to circulate because he was such an eccentric genius, such a unique individual. And Madonna, she was very similar. She was very unique. She came out in 1984 with Like a Virgin. And at the 1984 VMAs, she humped the stage. And people were just like, because they'd never seen a woman express sexuality in this way. They saw, of course, we had pop divas before. You know, Diana Ross was one. Um, Judy Garland was one. You know, we had so many of them before in pop culture, but never one like Madonna who was so abrasive with her sexuality before. It captured the imaginations of the new MTV audience. That was mostly, unlike the previous musical audience, was more visual. And Prince, he brought that Minnesota sound. He was so eclectic with his music that he would completely change the game, and there was nobody like him. Purple Rain was a tremendous movie and a tremendous album. To me, that really defined the decade. And yeah, I loved it. I thought it was awesome. I thought he was one of the few true original rock stars, you know, channeling the likes of Little Richard, channeling Jimi Hendrix, and channeling his own energy into what he was doing. So, Little Red Corvette, all that stuff. And then, you know, to avoid being owned by these record companies, he turned himself into a symbol later on in the decade. Anyway, in other types of music, particularly rock and roll, this was the glam rock era. It started with Def Leppard's Pyromaniac album, and they came over from England, and they had songs like "Pour Some Sugar on Me," and they would do this glam stuff. And then where they would wear all kinds of makeup and all kinds of stuff, and they looked like complete girls. You saw this with bands like Poison. You saw this with bands like Rat. You saw this with bands like um, Rat that sing Round Round Round. Anyway, you saw this with a lot of different bands. Motley Crue's was an example of this, and that was what defined rock and roll in those days. I'm not a big rock and roll person, aficionado, fan, so I couldn't be able to tell you. But I do know that it was very popular in those days, and it wasn't until Kurt Cobain that in the '90s that kind of music really changed. Another person that really defined the era musically, I say, is the boss, Bruce Springsteen. Bruce Springsteen's music was more for the working class people, the regular, everyday, average Joe. And he even came out with a song, Born in the USA, that President Reagan wanted to use on his campaign trail for re-election. And Bruce Springsteen said, wait a minute, you're not using my song for your campaign that want to want to launch fascism in places like Nicaragua and Grenada. My song is against Vietnam. My song was against the dangers of Vietnam. Speaking of Vietnam, it was a war that was still freshly embedded in our memories in the 1980s. So much so that they had a movie series called Rambo about an ex-Vietnam vet who goes back to Vietnam to try to avenge the loss of the United States in Vietnam. And people like President Reagan loved it. People, militaristic assholes like President Reagan loved that shit. Because they regret losing the war in Vietnam. They regret never winning. You know, but yeah. So that was the case with Bruce Springsteen's music, and I always thought that was funny because you would think a guy like Bruce would wanna would wanna um, embrace the working class ethos supposedly of Reagan, but no, he didn't. You know, um, in the beginning of the decade was really also a closing chapter. I forgot to mention this in the beginning, but it was the death of John Lennon. John Lennon, of course, the Beatle who got shot by Mark David Chapman. And this was a closing of an era because with John Lennon dead, that meant the Beatles were never going to get back together. And for many people who had grown up with the Beatles and grown up in the counterculture era of the 1960s, it was the end of an era. It was kind of like how we felt in 2009 when Michael Jackson died. Okay, like he's never coming back. He's dead. You know what I mean? Like it was a huge outpouring and a huge outcry for this celebrity who I didn't know. I didn't discover his music till much later, but it was huge in boomer culture. His songs, you know. So that was pretty much it in music. Um, in movies, in terms of movies, um, I say the biggest movie movie of the decade is E.T., produced by Steven Spielberg. This film to me was always like an allegory of Jesus. E.T. comes to Earth. He's rejected by Earthlings, and then he manifests himself in in our culture, and he's accepted by certain people in our culture, but largely he's rejected and unappreciated. It helped launch the careers of Drew Barrymore, and it helped make the phrase "ET phone home" a very popular phrase in the 1980s. And now Michael Jackson even had a picture with ET for a while. You know, the second biggest grossing movie franchise of the era was Back to the Future. And why I want to talk about this movie Back to the Future was because it was a perfect illustration of how the 1980s was very nostalgic for the 1950s. Not only because you had a president who um, was very 1950s esque, he prided himself on being a 1950s type politician, but you had a movie like this that was basically about how Marty McFly goes back to the 1950s to try and hook his parents up with each other, but inadvertently his mom falls in love with him. It's a very weird plot, but I say it's kind of cool, I guess. You know, and he had a famous car that was featured in it called the DeLorean, and the owner of the DeLorean was actually busted for cocaine possession, and they had to shut the making of the car down. So the car is famous not only because it was in Back to the Future, but because it was um, of the infamous way that it ended. It ended, you know. Um, other movies in the decade include like The Goonies with Corey Feldman, the John Hughes films like Pretty in Pink, like The Breakfast Club. They include the debut of my boy James Cameron in the Terminator movie. The Terminator movie was very, 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 very unique because it was a sci-fi movie, but it wasn't like a sci-fi movie though. It was structured like a horror movie, a slasher flick, and slasher flicks in the seven. I mean, starting with the '70s, starting with John Carpenter's Halloween, slasher flicks became all the rage in the '80s. You had Child's Play, you had uh, Nightmare on Elm Street, you had the Halloween series get bigger and bigger, and just slasher flicks all around the board. It hadn't been a thing. It was kind of a thing in '68 with Psycho, and then it became a thing in '79 with Halloween, like I said. But in the '80s, it dominated. And Terminator was sort of like that, but in a science fiction milieu. Because if you look at Terminator, he's chasing her around and he's trying to kill her. And he's in like Club Noir trying to kill her like this with a gun. And he's chasing her around just like he's Jason and Michael Myers and shit. You know? It was just cool. The second one wasn't like that. The second one was more action based. But the first one was very horror flick like. And I love the acting of Michael Biehn as Kyle Reese. Um, see what else was 80s. Stephen King movies were very 80s. Stephen King had the It series, the original one with Tim Curry. That was tremendous. I love the original It. I could watch that over and over and over again. Just to me, just epitomizes what 80s culture was about. And of course, the 80s had two of the Star Wars films in the franchise, Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. And both of them featured Yoda. And why I segue into this? Because it seemed like the 80s was the era of alien sidekicks. You had E.T., you had Yoda, and you had Alf on TV, the alien sidekick who loved to eat cats for breakfast. TV shows in the 1980s were just they were just in a bubble of their own. You know what I mean? Like the sitcom in the '70s was all about addressing social issues, addressing poverty, addressing racism, like in Good Times, like in All in the Family, like in Sanford and Son, all those Norman Lear sitcoms. But by the '80s, all that had been swept under the rug, and all you had was shows like Family, which was Family Ties was in a way it was the direct opposite of what All in the Family was. All in the Family was a conservative um, kid in Gloria. I mean, a conservative parents in Archie and Edith, and a and a liberal kids in Meathead and Gloria. Family Ties was the reverse of that. Family Ties was a conservative kid in Alex B. Keaton and his his liberal parents, his liberal hippie parents. We were meant to like the kids of the '80s were meant to laugh at the kids of the '60s. You know, it's, ha ha ha! You were too idealistic. We're back to normal now. So we idolize the kids of the '50s, and this is what really launched Michael J. Fox. But But he wasn't the only one. Growing Pains, Mike Sieber was he was a little bit bad, I guess, but he wasn't a really bad kid. It was a perfect, wholesome family show. The only thing different was that uh, Alan Thicke's character worked from home, which was new. But I say the biggest show of the 1980s, besides the Cosby Show, which I discussed in my other video, was probably Cheers. Cheers was very different because here you had an ex-alcoholic played by Ted Danson who owns a bar, and they were the Cheers was the first show to really start this whole will they won't they thing with Sam and Diane, and you know, which of course they did, and it had a pretty cool theme song. It was one of the longest running shows in history, and it really launched NBC's whole run with just classic shows. The must see TV brand that gave birth to Will and Grace, gave birth to Friends, gave birth to Frasier. Of course, Cheers launched Frasier directly, you know. But sports in the 80s was completely dominated by Magic Johnson and Larry Bird. When I think of sports in the 80s, I think of that. Also think of the dual sports superstars like Bo Jackson, who were there. And I think of Darryl Strawberry, and I think of the Mets winning the World Series in 1986. Just things that pop into my mind. And of course, the miracle on ice at the Olympics. The United States defeats Russia, so we never went to war directly. We were in a period at détente in which our leaders were discussing peace, but at the same time, we were still battling each other ideologically and in the hockey field. Now, in the realm of professional wrestling, here it comes, guys. I'm going to talk about it. I had to talk about it in the 80s. And like that's where it all started. It didn't all start there. It was wrestling before that, but wrestling before that had been um, very regional. Like WWE was New York territory, Texas was down south. Texas was the Von Erichs, Jim Crockett was the Carolinas, Georgia was owned by Jim Barnett. It was all subdivided. But in the 80s, 1982, when Vince McMahon Jr. bought the company, he decided he was going to buy up a bunch of other territories, which he did. The only one he couldn't buy up was Jim Crockett. He tried to buy up Jim Crockett in 1984. It resulted in Black Saturday, which was when fans in the Carolinas and fans in the South, more generally, they've been watching wrestling on TBS since the 1970s. And they were tuned in to see their regular NWA Southern style wrestling. And what do they see? They see Vince McMahon's people on there. Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage. Well, no, Randy Savage wasn't there. Hulk Hogan, George the Animal Steel, Superfly Jimmy Snuka, people like that. They didn't want to see that. So Vince McMahon ended up having to sell the company to Jim Crockett, and Jim Crockett Promotions then went on a roll. And Vince McMahon used that to finance the first WrestleMania. The first WrestleMania was really used to showcase Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan was the star that he starred in Rocky III in 1982, which I'm going to talk about the Rocky franchise. I'm going to backtrack and talk about the Rocky franchise a little bit. But he was in Rocky III in 1982. And he became a huge star in Vern Gagne's territory of Minnesota. And Vince McMahon stole him away And Vince's idea for the first WrestleMania was to do it with celebrities. Do it with Cyndi Lauper. Do it with Muhammad Ali. Do it with Liberace. Do it with the Rockettes. Do it with Billy Martin, the manager of the Yankees at the time, in Madison Square Garden in 1984. It was a success. And from that point on, he went on to produce several other WrestleMania shows in the 80s. When he reached his pinnacle, I believe, was when he had the show at Trump Tower. It was the return match between Randy Savage and Hulk Hogan for the title, in which Hulk Hogan won the championship for the second time. But Saturday Night's main event in 1987, it was a rematch because 87 was probably his best year because that was the year that Andre the Giant, the previous biggest star from the 70s, fought on the biggest star from the 80s, Hulk Hogan. Andre the Giant and Hulk Hogan, two giants collide and go against each other at WrestleMania 3. And the storyline leading up to it, and this was, keep in mind, this was at a time, like I said, when MTV was rising up and WWE was rising up at the same time. And being that they're both located in New York, MTV and WWE hooked up a lot. Even in Cyndi Lauper's video, Girls Just Want to Have Fun, you see a lot of wrestlers, and they brought Cyndi Lauper in to be part of the storylines at WrestleMania 1. And this was still going on by 1987, and that's why they call it the Rock and Wrestling era. But anyway, the two titans of the ring come together, they collide, and 93,000 plus fans packed the Pontiac Silverdome, setting all attendance record across the board for any indoor sporting events or entertainment events. And Hulk Hogan body slams Andre the Giant. And that's the pinnacle. But for their rematch, they also set a bunch of records for television. Ones that weren't even surpassed in the 90s when they had their biggest boom. It was just tremendous. And they did a referee switch where they had two twin referees. And they said that the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase, a wrestler that was premiering at that time, paid off that referee to give him a face job, a face change. So Andre the Giant sold the belt to Ted DiBiase. And it was just really funny stuff, really stupid, silly stuff. What do you want? It's wrestling. You know what I mean? Like, but while this was going on, the NWA was by Jim Crack Promotions was also building tremendous cards. They formed Ric Flair. They had built their promotion around Ric Flair. Ric Flair won his first World Heavyweight Championship in 1983 at Starrcade. And he had a successful run. He built a heel stable called the Four Horsemen with his friend Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard and Ole Anderson and later Barry Windham after 1988. And they were semi-successful, but unfortunately they were never able to reach the pinnacle of success that Vince McMahon and the WWE achieved in the 80s, becoming a household name and even having these ice cream bars for them and having cartoons, Hulk Hogan's Rockin' and Wrestling, and appearing on MTV the way they were, and appearing on Saturday Night Live with Mr. T and with Cyndi Lauper and all that. That really was WrestleMania 1 really cemented in people's minds something that was crazy, something that was a really pop culture phenomenon. WrestleManias 1 through 3. And really all the 80s WrestleManias. And of course, after the 80s, again, the steroid scandal and the lack of trust in Hulk Hogan and the Iraqi storyline at WrestleMania 7 would cause them to fall really back from business, but they would bounce up again in the 90s. Watch my 90s video if you want to know about that. But yeah, wrestling in the 80s was so huge that other companies owned by Sylvester Stallone's mom, called Glow, which they have a Netflix show about, even launched. And it came to define really uh, 80s culture. Because even when you see that movie, The Wrestler, that was put out in 2008 with Mickey Rourke, he's imitating an 80s wrestler. He's coming out to Welcome to the Jungle, and he's talking about cocaine. He's talking about things that are really 80s esque, But that's because of this boom. That's because of this initial boom period. Wrestling before the 1980s hadn't experienced the boom in 30 years. Last time was like in the 50s. You know, you know. So the 80s, with the advent of cable television, you couldn't have territories anymore because you had the cable overlay. And Vince, like I said, he started to take over everything. And Hulk Hogan was his catalyst. And the other end, Jim Crockett Promotions started to take over everything. And Starrcade was their main event, and Ric Flair was their catalyst. Um, um, Talking about the Rocky movies, I said I would talk about them. Like I said, Sylvester Stallone's mom was um, a wrestling promoter, and he really liked it. But in 1979, he had launched his own tale about faux fighting. It was a movie about a down in his luck boxer. Um, um, Looking to gain a shot at the champion Apollo Creed. Now, how is this connected in any way to professional wrestling besides um, Sylvester Stallone being a son of a wrestling promoter? He based it on Chuck Webner, and Chuck Webner actually fought in a match against Andre the Giant. Interesting tidbit. But this movie franchise dominated in the 80s, man. So much so that it even got caught up in the Cold War hype between Russia and the United States when Rocky and Rocky IV took on Ivan Drago, played by Dolph Lundgren. That was probably my favorite Rocky movie in the 80s. The other ones that came out in the 90s and the newer ones are really good. Um, what about animation in this era? Animation in this era in the 80s was, to me, it was dominated by Don Bluth. Don Bluth Studios came out with Secrets of Nim. They came out with Thumbelina, and they really changed the face of animation, giving Disney a run for their money. As I said, Disney was completely on the ropes. Disney never handles themselves well when they have a rival, and the 80s was like that for them. Thumbelina was very good. Land Before Time was very good. Um, uh, Five O Goes West was very good. All these Don Bluth movies were tremendous, and Disney didn't have anything really to match it. Animation on TV was pretty much stagnant at being in the 60s and 70s. The only thing different was due to the success of the Muppet Babies. Jim Henson died in 1989, and he sold before he died, he sold his company to Disney, and he sold the Muppets to Disney. So Disney decided to create a cartoon based around the fantasy that um, Kermit the Frog had in the Muppet movie. I mean, Miss Piggy had in the Muppet movie where they were babies. And I always remember this show because you never saw the nanny's face. You always saw just her legs. And other cartoon franchises tried to copy this. You had Young Flintstones and you had Young Scooby Doo, which is stupid. But in 1987, Hanna-Barbera did release one of the illest crossovers that ever existed on video, because VHS was on the rise, and that was one of the premier technologies at the time, pioneered by the porn industry, but cartoons took advantage of it. One of them was uh, Hanna-Barbera's crossover between the Flintstones and the Jetsons. Flintstones versus Jetsons. Now, could you guys imagine how epic that was watching that as a kid? Watching the two greatest Hanna-Barbera cartoons ever. interact. I loved it. I loved it. HBO first came out in the 80s, and one of the first shows they worked with was Fraggle Rock, another Jim Henson production. And people don't give this show enough credit. Jim Henson tried his whole entire life to create a more adult oriented cartoon and show. After he had done Sesame Street, they kind of pigeonholed him into a kid's show, but he always wanted to create something more edgy and something more adult, which he tried to do with Fraggle Rock. You um, that's pretty much it. Like I said, in terms of music, you had a lot of big name benefit shows that people would do, like Live Aid or Hands Across America for hunger in certain African countries. You had the uh, USA for Africa concert that Michael Jackson and Lionel Richie put together for the famine and the civil war in Ethiopia that was going on at the time, because Ethiopia was really in a state of unrest in the 1980s. You know, and as far as Israel, well, in 1987, the Second Intifada launched, and Israel invaded Lebanon and carried out the Sovereign Chatila massacre in Lebanon in 1987. So it's not really a good year for the state of Israel, and a good decade for the state of Israel, and not really a good year, good the state of the decade for us either, because during the Iran-Iraq War, we would arm Saddam, and during the Russian-Soviet War, we would arm the Afghans, who would turn around and become the Taliban. So that was the political ramifications of the whole deal with that. Overall, the 80s was defined by a lot of nationalism. It was a heavy nationalistic decade. The United States stupidly thought we could save the entire world from communism, and while Reagan's words did ring true with Gorbachev, and Gorbachev did tear down this wall, and I always remember that iconic scene, because Miguel Gorbachev's head was like, he was halfway bald, so you would see like his birthmark on his head as he would sign these papers with Reagan and the nuclear proliferation treaty. It was just funny. It was just like, what the hell, man? Put on a hat. But he instituted glasnost and perestroika and some economic liberalization, similar to what China did in '97. But it didn't lead to the breakdown of the Chinese communist economy, but it did to the Russians. It came tumbling down. In terms of space, this wasn't a great year for space. A teacher, Sally Ride, had gone into space in the Challenger in 1986, and it blew up, and it was very sad for our nation. And those were some of the things that happened. John Cougar Mellencamp released a kick-ass song that I still listen to this day, called A Little Ditty About Jack and Diane. And ultimately, the greatest artist in the world became a soloist and became a household name, Michael Jackson. And the best thing that happened in the 1980s, besides all this that I'm talking about, the best thing that happened in the 1980s was the birth of yours truly. Peace. Forget about the end of apartheid. Forget about the decline of communism. Forget about Michael Jackson doing the moonwalk. Forget about Hulk Hogan body slamming Andre the Giant. Forget about Live Aid. Forget about them Just Say No campaign. The best thing that ever happened in the 1980s was this guy right here. you know,